At 7:42 a.m. on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna huddled beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning at WWII Airfield in New Guinea, his eyes fixed on the young pilot gearing up for a mission that seemed all but a death sentence. That pilot was 23-year-old Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a flyer with 6 combat sorties under his belt, and not a single enemy killed a show for it. Waiting to intercept their morning patrol were 18 Japanese Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters, and Hayes was flying straight into their path. McKenna had spent 8 months maintaining P-38s, knowing every nut, bolt, and mechanical quirk of the twin-engine, twin-boom fighter like the back of his hand. The Lightning was a speed demon in straight lines and a powerhouse at high altitudes, but it had a fatal flaw that was picking off American pilots daily. It couldn't outturn a Zero. Lighter and far more agile, the Zero could complete a full horizontal turn in half the time the P-38 needed during a dogfight, a split-second difference that spelled certain death. U.S. combat doctrine was crystal clear on the matter. P-38 pilots were never to engage in turning battles with Zeros, never to attempt outmaneuvering them. The playbook called for hit-and-run tactics. Use speed and altitude to dive in, fire a burst, then climb away before the enemy could react. But Hayes had tried that strategy 5 times, and each time it failed. The Zero pilots were too cunning. They baited Americans into turning fights, sliced inside their turning radius, latched onto their tails, and shot them down. In just 6 weeks, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s, most of them falling prey after being trapped in turning engagements they couldn't escape. McKenna had watched too many good men die. Kids, really, who climbed into their Lightnings with confidence and either came back in body bags or didn't come back at all. The official training manuals chalk the losses up to pilot error, with instructors insisting flyers weren't following doctrine. But McKenna knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots, it was the control cables. The P-38's aileron control cables snaked through the twin booms to the tail section, then ran forward via pulleys to the wing's control surfaces. The system had slack, barely 3/8 of an inch at full deflection, but that minuscule bit of give created a deadly lag between the pilot's stick movement and the aileron's response. At high speeds, the delay was negligible, but during tight, low-speed turning maneuvers, that fraction of a second was the difference between rolling inside a Zero's turn and getting blown out of the sky. 2 months prior, McKenna had brought this issue to the engineering officer's attention. The response? The cable tension was within factory specifications, and any modifications would void the aircraft's warranty. What's more, no field mechanic had the authority to alter flight control systems, a change that required sign-off from Lockheed, 7,000 miles away in California. So McKenna did something that violated every rule in the Army Air Force's maintenance manual. He scavenged a piece of piano wire from a damaged P-38, cut it to 6 inches, bent it into a Z shape, and installed it as a makeshift tensioner on Lieutenant Hayes' left aileron control cable. The whole modification took just 8 minutes, adding a mere 0.4 pounds of tension to the cable and eliminating the slack entirely. And no one noticed. The morning inspection crew was preoccupied with checking engine oil levels and ammunition loads, paying no mind to the control cables. McKenna had learned the hard way how costly that slack could be, starting with Lieutenant David Chen. On July 9, 1943, Chen, who'd been in the theater for 3 weeks, took off at 6:15 a.m. for a fighter sweep mission. 2 hours later, he returned with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a harrowing tale of a Zero that had nearly gotten the drop on him. Chen explained that he'd tried to roll out and dive away as the manual dictated, but the plane felt sluggish, like there was a split-second delay between moving the stick and the aircraft responding. Only his wingman shooting the Zero off his tail had saved him. McKenna examined the bullet holes, tight, precise groupings that were the mark of perfect deflection shooting. The Zero pilot had anticipated exactly where Chen's plane would be, a feat that shouldn't have been possible if Chen had rolled and dived instantly. Unless that tiny cable delay had given the enemy just enough time to line up the shot. Chen never flew that P-38 again. It was sent back to the depot for repairs, and McKenna never saw him. 3 weeks later, he heard Chen had been killed flying a different Lightning over Rabaul, felled by the same old story, trapped in a turning fight, unable to roll out fast enough. The second pilot to fall was Captain William Morrison, a seasoned flight leader with 11 kills who knew the P-38 inside and out and respected its limitations. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. He took out 1 Zero on the first pass, then circled back for another run, only to have 2 Zeros reverse course and zero in on him. McKenna later listened to the radio transcripts from that mission. Morrison screamed that his controls felt mushy as he tried to roll inverted and execute a split S to escape. The Zeros stayed on his tail through the maneuver, shooting him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison's wingman reported that it looked like the captain was fighting the plane itself, that the Lightning wasn't responding fast enough. Morrison died on impact. His crew chief, a Texan named Rodriguez and a friend of McKenna's, was convinced something was wrong with the aircraft. After the wreckage was recovered, he checked every system, engine settings, control surface rigging, cable tension, only to find everything within official specs. The official report blamed pilot error. Rodriguez didn't buy it, neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots perish. Some he knew well, most he'd only met briefly during pre-flight checks. But he'd worked on all their planes, signed off on their maintenance logs, and watched them taxi down the runway and take to the sky. Some returned, battered but alive, others didn't. Those who made it back told the same story. The P-38 felt slow to respond during hard maneuvers, with a faint but deadly lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots chalked it up to the Lightning's nature, a heavy fighter with large control surfaces, so some delay was to be expected. But McKenna knew better. He'd felt that slack with his own hands while working on the cables, had noticed the difference in the twang of loose cables versus tight ones during maintenance. Every P-38 on the flight line had cables that sounded just a little too loose, within specs but loose enough to kill. After Morrison's death, McKenna mentioned his theory to Rodriguez one evening. When Rodriguez asked what could be done, McKenna replied, "Nothing official, but unofficially, there's a fix. It just means breaking enough rules to get both of us court-martialed." The real tragedy wasn't that American pilots didn't know the rules. They did. Every mission briefing hammered home the no-turning edict. Every training flight drilled hit-and-run tactics into their muscle memory. The problem was that combat didn't play by the rulebook. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months, a farm boy from Iowa who'd flown 6 combat missions without a single kill. Not because he was a bad pilot, but because he followed the rules to a T. And those rules kept putting him in positions where he couldn't land a shot. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dived on a Zero from high altitude, hitting 400 miles per hour as he approached from the sun, just like the manual said. He had the Zero dead in his sights, started to lead his target for a deflection shot, and then the enemy snap-rolled left and dove away. Hayes tried to follow, but his P-38 felt like it was moving through molasses. By the time the plane pointed where he wanted it, the Zero was long gone. He pulled out, climbed back to altitude, and never fired a single bullet. His 4th mission was even worse. Hayes and his wingman ambushed 2 Zeros at 15,000 feet. Hayes fired the first burst and missed. The Zero reversed hard right, and Hayes rolled to pursue. That's when his wingman shouted a warning. 2 more Zeros were diving in from above. Hayes tried to roll level and escape, but the plane's sluggish response gave one of the diving Zeros just enough time to riddle his right boom with 20-millimeter cannon fire. The shells didn't penetrate, but the near miss scared Hayes so badly that he broke off the fight and fled for home, his engine sputtering and smoking. Then came the 5th mission, the one that broke him. Hayes watched his wingman, 21-year-old Lieutenant Thomas Parker from Boston, die right in front of him. The two had trained together, and on August 14th, they got separated from their formation during a dogfight over Finchhafen. 2 Zeros latched onto Parker's tail, and he tried everything to escape: hard rolls, reversals, scissors maneuvers, but the Zeros stayed with him every step of the way. Hayes listened in horror over the radio as Parker screamed for help, his voice cracking with panic as he yelled, "The plane's not turning fast enough." Then came the sound of gunfire, followed by silence. Hayes didn't sleep a wink that night. Neither did most of the squadron. Parker's bunk remained empty. His personal belongings packed up and shipped back to his family, his P-38 written off as a combat loss. The maintenance log noted no mechanical issues. The official cause was pilot error during defensive maneuvers. But McKenna had worked on Parker's plane that very morning, checking every system until it was perfect. Engine timing, control surface alignment, cable tension, all within spec. The plane was fine, but Parker was dead, and McKenna knew exactly why. That fraction of a second delay, that tiny bit of slack the manual deemed acceptable, had killed him, just like it had killed Morrison, Chen, and 14 others. The worst part was the smell. Every morning, McKenna stepped into the maintenance area and was hit with the acrid stench of aviation fuel, hot metal, and hydraulic fluid. The smell of planes being readied for combat. Some of those planes would come back, others wouldn't, and McKenna would be back the next morning, breathing that same smell, working on more lightnings, watching more pilots walk out to machines that couldn't respond fast enough to keep them alive. On the evening of August 16th, Hayes wandered into the maintenance area and found McKenna tinkering with his assigned P-38. The young lieutenant cut straight to the chase, asking if there was anything at all, McKenna could do to make the plane roll faster. He didn't care if it violated regulations, he just wanted a fighting chance to survive. McKenna studied Hayes's face, saw the raw fear and desperation in his eyes, saw a kid who knew he was going to die unless something changed. He told Hayes to come back at dawn. He'd see what he could do. The maintenance hangar fell quiet after 11 p.m. Most of the crew had turned in for the night, leaving only the distant rumble of generators and the faint buzz of insects colliding with the overhead lights. The air was thick with the smell of engine oil and tropical humidity as McKenna pried off the inspection panel on Hayes's P-38 left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's scorching sun, and inside he could see the aileron control cables snaking through a series of pulleys. He grabbed the cable with both grease-covered hands and pulled, feeling the slack give way, about 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension kicked in. His fingers ached from a full day of wrenching and adjusting, but he could feel it plainly. That slack was a death sentence. The piano wire he'd scavenged came from a P-38 that had ground looped 2 weeks earlier, a total wreck bound for the depot. Before it was hauled away, McKenna had stripped out useful parts, including a 6-inch length of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system. He'd stuffed it in his tool bag at the time, not really sure why, until now. McKenna sat cross-legged on the hangar floor, the wire in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other, bending the metal into a sharp Z shape. The wire was stiff, resisting the pliers with every twist, and his hand slipped twice. On the second attempt, he sliced his thumb open, blood smearing across the wire and his grease-stained coveralls. He wiped the blood away on his sleeve and kept working, finally getting the bend right after 8 minutes of careful effort. The Z shape would act as an inline tensioner, adding just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack entirely. Installing it was the hard part. The space inside the boom was cramped, forcing McKenna to work one-handed while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam jiggled constantly, casting shadows that danced across the cable system, and his shoulder was wedged tight against the boom's metal frame, the sharp edge digging into his skin. Sweat soaked through his coveralls despite the cool night air as he disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, his fingers fumbling with the clevis pin. He dropped it, listening as it clattered and bounced somewhere inside the boom, then spent 5 nerve-wracking minutes groping around in the dark until he found it. His heart hammered in his chest the entire time. If the engineering officer caught him modifying a flight control system without authorization, using a non-standard part no less, he'd face a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, maybe even prison time. But Hayes was going to die if he did nothing. So McKenna pushed the fear aside, slipped the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, and reconnected the cable. The fit was tight, forcing him to hammer the clevis pin into place with the butt of his pliers. When it finally seated, he tested the tension by hand, pulling on the cable. No slack. The control surface moved instantly, in perfect sync with his tug. Perfection. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, cleaned up his tools, wiped the blood from the wire, and his hands and slipped out of the hangar at 1:15 a.m. The tropical night was thick with humidity, still and silent, except for the distant drone of aircraft engines. Japanese night raiders, most likely. The sound turned his stomach to knots. He'd just broken a dozen regulations, modified a fighter plane without approval, and if the tweak failed mid-flight, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would be responsible. But if it worked, Hayes might live. McKenna stumbled back to his bunk, but sleep eluded him. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, until the first faint glow of dawn painted the horizon. At 6:30 a.m., he walked to the flight line, watching as ground crew fueled and armed Hayes's P-38, watching as Hayes trundled off for his pre-flight briefing, then climbed into the cockpit, his shoulders squared with quiet resolve. At 7:42 a.m., the Lightning's engines roared to life, and Hayes taxied down the runway before lifting off into the bright morning sky. McKenna stood rooted to the tarmac, his eyes fixed on the P-38 as it climbed higher and higher, joining a formation of 16 other Lightnings before turning northwest toward Japanese-held airspace. And then, there was nothing left to do but wait. The engagement erupted at 8:14 a.m. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s intercepted 18 Zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf, with the morning sun at their backs. A perfect setup for a diving attack. Hayes was flying in the number 3 position, and when his element leader called out the bounce, the Lightnings rolled over and dove. Hayes picked out a 0 at the rear of the enemy formation, accelerating to 380 miles per hour as he closed in. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight, the painted rising sun on its fuselage clear as day, and Hayes could even see the pilot's head bobbing inside the canopy. He squeezed the trigger, and the P-38's 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon roared to life, tracers streaking toward the target. Most of the rounds missed, but a few sparked off the 0's wing, nothing fatal. The 0 pilot reacted instantly, snap rolling right and diving away. Hayes rolled to follow, and that's when he felt the difference. The plane responded instantly, no lag, no sluggishness. The stick moved, and the Lightning rolled exactly where he wanted it to go, like it was reading his mind. Hayes had never felt the P-38 handle like this. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the control system. He completed a 90-degree roll in half the time it usually took, yanking the nose down to keep the 0 in his sights. He fired another 3-second burst, and this time, the rounds found their mark, tearing up the 0's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The enemy plane's engine exploded in a ball of flame, pieces flying off as it rolled inverted and plummeted toward the jungle below, trailing a thick plume of black smoke. Hayes had his first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio, screaming a warning. 3 Zeros were diving in from above, their engines screaming as they closed in fast. They'd seen him shoot down their comrade, and now they wanted revenge. Hayes shoved the throttles forward, trying to climb away, but the 0's were faster in their dive. They'd be on his tail in seconds. His every instinct screamed to keep climbing, to run, to follow the doctrine. But doctrine had gotten him nowhere but close to death. So Hayes did the unthinkable. He rolled hard left and pulled into a tight turn, ready to fight. The P-38 snapped around with a responsiveness Hayes had never dreamed possible, the nose slicing through the horizon as he locked eyes on the lead 0. The Japanese pilot had tried to follow Hayes's turn, but he hadn't anticipated how fast the Lightning would react, leaving him exposed out of position. Hayes led his target, squeezed the trigger, and watched as his rounds shredded the 0's left wing root. The wing folded like a piece of paper, and the plane tumbled out of control. 2 kills in 30 seconds. The remaining 2 Zeros tried to outmaneuver him with scissors maneuvers, alternating turns in a desperate bid to force him to overshoot. But Hayes stayed right with them, his P-38 responding instantly to every flick of the stick. No delay, no fighting the controls. It was like flying an entirely new aircraft. 1 Zero made a fatal mistake, reversing too hard and bleeding off too much speed. Hayes sliced inside his turning radius, closing to just 200 feet, point-blank range, before firing a burst that tore the enemy plane apart. Debris rained down past his canopy, and he felt the P-38 shudder as a piece of the 0 slammed into his right boom. 3 kills. The fourth Zero broke off the fight and fled, and Hayes didn't chase. He was low on fuel and ammunition, and the fight was over. He climbed back to altitude, linking up with the tattered remains of his flight, and they set course for home. The entire engagement had lasted just 7 minutes. When Hayes landed at WWII Airfield at 9:03 a.m., McKenna was waiting for him on the flight line, his heart in his throat. The Lightning's engine sputtered to a stop, and Hayes climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked through with sweat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclip his harness. He walked straight over to McKenna, his eyes wide with disbelief, and said 2 simple words. It worked. Neither man had any idea that 6 other pilots had watched the entire engagement unfold from higher altitude, including Captain Frank Mitchell, a flight leader with the 475 fighter group. Mitchell had been orbiting at 15,000 feet, observing Hayes' element take on the Zeros below, when something caught his eye. Hayes' P-38 was rolling faster than any Lightning he'd ever seen, snapping through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should. Mitchell knew every pilot in the theater, knew their skill levels inside and out, and while Hayes was good, he wasn't that good. There was something different about his plane. After landing, Mitchell tracked Hayes down to the debriefing room, where the young lieutenant was still buzzing with adrenaline, his hands shaking as he filled out his combat report. 3 confirmed kills, a feat that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Mitchell asked him point blank what had changed. Hayes shrugged, saying he didn't know. The plane just responded faster, more crisply than it ever had before. When Mitchell pressed, asking if the maintenance crew had done anything to the aircraft, Hayes told him to talk to Technical Sergeant James McKenna. 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area, his hands black with grease as he worked on another P-38's engine. Mitchell cut straight to the chase. "What did you do to Hayes' plane?" McKenna stared at him for a long, tense moment, then decided to tell the truth, the whole truth. He explained the slack in the control cables, the deadly lag it caused, the engineering officer's refusal to authorize changes, and the makeshift piano wire tensioner he'd installed the night before. He laid out every regulation he'd broken, every risk he'd taken. Mitchell listened in silence, never interrupting. When McKenna finished, he simply asked one question: "Can you do the same modification to my plane?" McKenna agreed, but not without warning him of the risks. The tweak was unapproved, untested, and if anything went wrong, both of them would face military justice. Mitchell didn't hesitate. He'd lost 4 pilots in his flight in the past month, all of them trapped in turning fights they couldn't escape. If this modification could save lives, regulations could wait. That evening, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38 using the same method: 6 inches of piano wire bent into a Z shape, installed as an inline tensioner to eliminate cable slack. The next morning, Mitchell took the plane up, and when he landed, he was raving about the difference. "It flies like a fighter, not a truck," he told his wingman. Word spread quickly, and soon Mitchell's wingman was asking McKenna for the same modification. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 P-38s, his makeshift fix spreading through the squadron like wildfire. Pilots whispered about it in the ready room, and mechanics swapped tips in the maintenance bays. No official paperwork, no engineering sign-off, just a shared desire to keep their friends alive. Some crew chiefs refused to touch the modification, citing regulations, but others jumped at the chance to give their pilots a fighting edge. McKenna showed them how it was done: cut the wire, bend the Z shape, install the tensioner. Simple, quick, and deadly effective. Hayes capitalized on the modification immediately, shooting down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd. Mitchell bagged 3 more on August 25th. Slowly but surely, pilots who'd returned from missions empty-handed for weeks started coming back with kill marks painted on their P-38s. The shift in statistics was impossible to ignore. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at WWII, heard about the modification from a pilot who'd transferred from WWII. Skeptical at first, he decided to test it on one of his unit's Lightnings. The results were staggering. The pilot returned from his next mission with his first kill after 8 weeks of fruitless combat. Watkins wasted no time modifying 4 more planes, and soon other crew chiefs in the 49th were following suit. By early September, an estimated 40 P-38s across New Guinea had been fitted with McKenna's piano wire tensioner. The engineering officer at WWII eventually noticed that something was off. Cable tension readings seemed inconsistent, but he could never pin down the cause. That's because the crew chiefs had a system. They removed the tensioners before official inspections, then reinstalled them as soon as the officers left. The pilots knew, the mechanics knew, and everyone kept the secret. The tide of the air war in the Pacific began to turn. In July, American pilots had lost 2 P-38s for every zero they shot down. By August, that ratio had dropped to 1.3 to 1. By September, it was nearly even. Something had shifted, and the Japanese were the first to notice. In late August, flight reports from Japan's 11th Air Fleet began to trickle in, noting a disturbing change in American P-38 tactics. The Lightnings were maneuvering more aggressively, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction with a speed and precision that had never been seen before. Tactics that had worked reliably for months, baiting Americans into turning fights, were suddenly failing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills, learned this lesson the hard way on September 3, 1943. He engaged a P-38 over Wewak, deploying his signature tactic: draw the American into a turn, wait for the P-38 to start its roll, then snap his own turn in the opposite direction to slice inside the Lightning's turning radius. But this time, the P-38 reversed with him, matching his every move with impossible speed. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times, knowing exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll. But this plane defied all his expectations. He barely avoided a head-on collision, and the American pilot got off a burst that forced Sakai to dive away in a panic. He returned to base confused and frustrated, unable to explain why the P-38 had suddenly become so agile. Other veteran Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying any differently. They still relied on hit-and-run tactics, but their planes were responding faster, fractionally, but enough to disrupt the timing the Zero pilots had spent months mastering. Japanese intelligence scrambled to figure out what had changed, examining the wreckage of downed P-38s for any sign of new weapons or modifications. But they found nothing. The planes looked identical to the ones they'd been fighting for months, with the same engines, the same armament, the same airframe. What they didn't know was that the game-changing modification was hidden inside the P-38's boom, a 6-inch piece of piano wire that looked like just another part of the system. Even if they'd found it, they would never have guessed its purpose. By mid-September, the psychological toll on Japanese pilots was mounting. For 2 years, Zero flyers had ruled the skies in turning fights, confident they could outmaneuver any American aircraft. That confidence was shattered. Pilots who once pressed attacks relentlessly now grew cautious, hesitant to engage P-38s for fear of falling victim to the Lightning's newfound agility. Some Japanese pilots tried to adapt, abandoning turning fights for hit-and-run tactics of their own, but that meant surrendering their greatest advantage. The Zero's strength was maneuverability. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms, where the Lightning's speed, firepower, endurability gave it the upper hand. Others doubled down on aggression, closing to point-blank range before firing, but without the ability to outturn their enemies, this just meant dying faster. Several of Japan's most experienced aces were shot down in September, felled by tactics that had worked flawlessly just 2 months earlier. The Japanese were fighting an invisible enemy. They knew something had changed, but they had no idea what, and that made it impossible to develop counter-tactics. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s, while American losses stood at just 22. The kill ratio had reversed. For the first time in the Pacific War, Lightnings were shooting down Zeros at a better-than-even rate. Japanese High Command issued a new order: avoid engaging P-38s unless you have overwhelming numerical superiority. It was a turning point. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted, all because of a piece of piano wire that no one was supposed to install. The modification never became official during the war. The Army Air Force's Engineering Command finally caught wind of it in October 1943, when a maintenance inspector at WWII noticed inconsistent cable tension readings and traced them back to McKenna's makeshift tensioners. He wrote a detailed report and sent it up the chain of command, where it sat on desks for weeks as officers debated what to do. The modification violated every regulation in the book, but it worked. Squadrons using the tweak had drastically better kill ratios, and pilots were coming home alive. Eventually, the report made its way to Lockheed's engineers in California. They tested the modification, measured cable tension, calculated stress loads, and ran flight tests. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The piano wire tensioner was safe, effective, and should have been part of the P-38's original design. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model, which entered production in December 1943. But McKenna never received any official credit for his innovation. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any official report. Lockheed's documentation attributed the control system improvement to engineering analysis, and McKenna's name was nowhere to be found. Hayes survived the war, flying 63 combat missions and shooting down 11 Japanese aircraft before returning to Iowa in 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, had 4 children, and spent 37 years working as a crop duster. He never forgot what McKenna had done for him. Every year on August 17, he picked up the phone and called McKenna to thank him for saving his life. Mitchell survived too, rising through the ranks to become a squadron commander and leading his unit through the Philippines campaign, where he shot down 16 more enemy planes. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1963. He told the story of McKenna's modification to every young maintenance officer he supervised, drilling into them a simple lesson. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from engineering committees. They come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the brass misses. McKenna left the Army Air Forces in 1946 and returned to California, going back to his roots as an auto mechanic. In 1948, he opened his own garage in Long Beach, where he worked on car engines for the next 42 years. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he'd just say he was a mechanic, that he fixed airplanes, nothing more. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications stumbled upon references to the piano wire tensioner in old maintenance logs from New Guinea. Tracking McKenna down through veteran registries, the historian found him at 73 years old, still working part-time in his Long Beach garage. When asked about the modification, McKenna confirmed the story, dismissing it as nothing special, just something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the tweak had saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives, based on the improved survival rates of squadrons that used it. McKenna shrugged off the number. He didn't care about the count. He just remembered the pilots who came back, Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the others. That was reward enough. James McKenna died in 2006 at the age of 88 and was buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in California. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic, but it said nothing about the piano wire tensioner, nothing about how he'd changed the way American fighters flew, nothing about how he'd broken every rule in the book to save lives. His Long Beach garage is still standing, now under new ownership, but in the back office, a faded photograph hangs on the wall. A young mechanic in grease-stained coveralls, standing next to a P-38 Lightning. The date scrawled on the back reads, August 1943, New Guinea. That's how innovation truly happens in war, not through official channels or red tape, but through sergeants and mechanics who see a problem, find a solution, and refuse to wait for permission to do what's right. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.